Great. We'll go ahead and get started. And we're thrilled to have you all here today. Good afternoon and welcome to today's briefing, America Leads Sustaining U.S. Innovation in Rare Disease. My name is Stacy Frisk, and I currently serve as the Executive Director of the Rare Disease Company Coalition. We are 32 life sciences companies that are dedicated to developing and delivering treatments for people with rare diseases. And collectively, our members bring more than 530 years of rare disease innovation experience to this space. And each year, our members invest nearly 3/4 of their expenditures into research and development. And collectively, this is an investment of around $20 billion per year, all into research and development into new treatments for rare diseases. These investments have already contributed to the approval of more than 50 rare disease therapies, and our members have more than 230 rare disease pipeline programs in development. And many of these treatments are for conditions that currently have no FDA-approved treatment options. And so today's conversation comes at a really critical time. We've seen tremendous advances in scientific innovation in the area of rare disease. And so for the U.S. to continue to lead in rare disease innovation, we must ensure that these breakthroughs translate into real treatments for people with rare diseases. And this leadership in the U.S. requires not just scientific excellence, but also policy frameworks that support innovation in rare disease, support access to treatment, and also a sustainable rare disease ecosystem. And so that's why we brought together an outstanding panel today, and I'm really thrilled to have our esteemed panel share their insights from across the rare disease landscape and many perspectives on how we can maintain as a country and grow our momentum in rare disease innovation and ultimately bringing new treatments to patients. So I'm really honored to be joined today by four people in the rare disease community who represent the real breadth and depth of expertise in rare disease. Deanna Portero is the Vice President of Partnership and Innovation at the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator. Arya Singh is a PhD candidate and program coordinator at NYU Langone Health and also a rare disease patient advocate. Dr. Ryan Farrell is a pediatric endocrinologist at University Hospitals Cleveland Medical Center, a member of the Ohio Rare Disease Advisory Council, and a rare disease parent. And Ritu Baral is a managing director and senior biotechnology analyst at Cowen & Company and a board member of the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. And so I'm just so thrilled to have each of you here today to be part of this important conversation. And to kick us off, I'm pleased to turn it over to Deanna Portero to begin our discussion. Deanna?
Thank you, Stacey. We appreciate the invitation from the Rare Disease Company Coalition for the invitation to speak at this briefing, and thank Congressional staff for joining us to learn about this important topic. I'll begin with some background to help contextualize why rare diseases are such an extraordinary and urgent public health crisis. There are over 400 million people worldwide affected by rare diseases, with about 30 million affected in the US alone. Over 10,000 rare diseases have been documented, with about 200 more characterized for the first time each year. Only about 5% have a single FDA-approved treatment. These are typically extremely serious conditions, debilitating at best and lethal at worst. Because the progression of rare genetic diseases are often so brutal, 50% of patients are children, and 3 of 10 will die by age 5. Rare diseases are defined in the US as a population of 200,000 or fewer, but the reality is that most rare diseases are much, much smaller. Sometimes called ultra-rare diseases, 90% of rare diseases affect populations in the US in the low thousands or less. These diseases are extremely expensive to manage when untreated. A recent analysis found that the overall economic burden of untreated rare disease is over $1 trillion annually. The good news is that we have an incredible new scientific toolbox for creating therapies for rare diseases, led largely by the American life science ecosystem. With advanced technologies like gene therapies, CRISPR, and antisense oligonucleotides, it's become easier and faster than ever to design a therapy for rare genetic disease. We've seen an explosion of potential therapies developed in the US, driven through preclinical testing by small biotechs, academics, and patient communities. Frankly, many of these therapies have the potential to reverse, slow down, or delay diseases that are death sentences. The bad news is on this slide. The tide has turned against moving these therapies forward. The graph on the right depicts a dramatic drop in the amount of funding that biotechs have been able to raise to bring these therapies to patients. We'll be talking about the bullets in blue during panel discussion. Those are the whys. What you see in purple is the consequences. R&D for hundreds of programs have stopped moving forward for business reasons, even therapies that have compelling early results in humans. This affects everyone in the American life sciences ecosystem, but most importantly, it affects patient communities. These situations are unfathomably cruel to patients. Can you imagine if your child or sibling had a lethal illness and the only clinical trial for that disease, a clinical trial that had promising results in several other children, shut down with no plans to resume and no company interested in marketing it? That's the reality for dozens of ultra-rare diseases. My organization has reviewed clinical data for well over 50 shelved programs. We've seen literal cures shelved because investors weren't confident enough that it would be profitable enough to justify tying up their dollars. This situation inspired our founding at the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator as a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission to create a viable commercial path forward for promising shelved treatments for ultra-rare diseases so that patients can get sustainable access to life-changing therapies. In many respects, we operate like a traditional biotech. We in-license technologies, complete clinical trials, and market approved therapies. But we change the math in a number of important ways. An important part of our strategy is to negotiate with all of the cost-driving partners, from the original holders of IP to the manufacturers and clinical service providers, to move from upfront payment models to risk-sharing models. We say, let's do this together so that we can reach final marketing approval where patients can gain access. Then we'll all share the proceeds. And the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator will put the returns that we keep toward more programs. Even with this strategy, we need operating funds. As a 501c3 nonprofit, part of our fundraising strategy is philanthropic capital. But because of the amount of funds needed to achieve our impact at scale, we still also seek return-seeking capital and face a lot of challenges raising enough funds to get these drugs to marketing approval. Our mission became more challenging last year. For the last 10 months, we've had to present this slide to potential funders and potential partners with an asterisk, because a linchpin federal incentive for developing therapies for children with rare diseases, the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher, lapsed. So what is a PRV and why is it important? How does it work? First, in order to be eligible to get one of these vouchers, you must be developing a therapy for a rare pediatric disease. This is in recognition that these diseases are diseases where innovation is possible and urgent, but difficult, requiring additional incentives. Then, if and only if you meet FDA standard for drug marketing approval, you get a PRV. When we look at the history of this program, the evidence is clear that PRVs are awarded for developing therapies with urgent unmet need. For the vast majority of diseases that have received approval and a voucher through this program, this was the very first FDA-approved drug for that condition. Then that biotech can sell the PRV on the free market to other drug companies. Importantly, that means that other pharma companies, not the US taxpayer, are the source of the financial incentive for creating a therapy for rare pediatric diseases. These vouchers are not nearly as valuable to other rare disease therapeutic developers because they often automatically qualify for the benefits of the voucher. This voucher program launched in 2012. Once it became clear that there was a robust and stable market of buyers, led to the development of programs and entire companies who built their business models around the anticipated sale of a PRV. Finally, the buyer of the PRV, the new owner of the PRV, can redeem that voucher for a different indication to get expedited review of a different drug. Now, this gets them their marketing approval decision, whether favorable or unfavorable, about 4 months faster. The Rare Pediatric Disease PRV program lapsed in December 2024, despite robust bipartisan support and the united support of the rare disease ecosystem. Children with rare diseases need Congress to pass the Give Kids a Chance Act without delay to restore the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Voucher Program. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, Deanna. And next, I would like to invite Dr. Ryan Farrell for any opening remarks.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak. My name is Ryan Farrell. I've been a pediatric endocrinologist in Cleveland, Ohio for the past 10 years, caring for children with rare diseases and their families. But I'm also here today as the father of a boy with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a progressive muscle wasting rare disease. When my son Frankie was born back in 2020, we quickly realized that something was wrong. His tone was low, he choked easily, his development was delayed. And after 15 months of appointments and testing, we had an answer. He was born with a deletion in the dystrophin gene. And as a physician, I already knew what Duchenne was, but as a father, hearing his prognosis was devastating. Declines in his strength, loss of walking in the teenage years, progressive loss of swallowing and breathing function, and death in young adulthood. A decade ago, steroids were really our only treatment option. It modestly slowed the disease course, but came with lots of difficult side effects. But today, thanks to investment in rare disease treatments, there are now 8 approved therapies for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, including the first gene therapy. Frankie has benefited from 2 of these treatments. Since diagnosis, he's received weekly infusions that help his body produce dystrophin. And a year ago, he received a one-time gene therapy named Elevidys to replace the missing gene in his body. These therapies reached him sooner because of government policies and programs that promote rare disease innovation. As we already mentioned, the Pediatric Rare Disease Priority Review Voucher Program gives companies the ability to speed up FDA review for a promising treatment or to sell that voucher to fund development of more therapies. This program directly funded the treatment that my son Frankie now receives on a weekly basis. These therapies are also available because the FDA has shown flexibility in things like study design and in weighing the totality of evidence for rare diseases, particularly when there's an unmet need. This flexibility is critical. Traditional, large, placebo-controlled trials are impossible in many rare diseases, and disease progression can be quite variable, making it hard to compare apples to apples. When the FDA is consistent and flexible, investment flows and innovation thrives, but when it doesn't, patients suffer. The FDA's accelerated approval pathway has also been essential for our son. Duchenne progresses slowly and it can take years for treatments to show measurable benefit. But through the accelerated approval pathway, patients can access therapies earlier based on biomarkers, things like dystrophin production, while we wait for the longer-term functional data. Without this pathway, we would have had to wait nearly a decade to access the therapies that are just now proving their clinical benefit. For Frankie, that waiting would have meant irreversible decline. Instead, early access has been life-changing for our son. A year now after his gene therapy, he climbs stairs, he jumps, he runs without falling. These are things he had never done in his first 4 years of life. His muscle enzyme levels have fallen from off the charts to nearly normal. This has delayed the need for things like wheelchairs, costly home modifications. It's allowed me to continue working, and it's given our family something priceless, time to enjoy our son. In the Duchenne community, our mantra is time is muscle. For families like mine, this is not abstract policy. It's about whether our children have a fighting chance. Every month matters, every day matters. We are exceptionally privileged in the DMD community to have 8 approved therapies. As we mentioned already, most rare diseases still have none. For those families, these barriers seem steep. The stakes are even higher. That's why it's critical to preserve and strengthen things like the accelerated approval pathway, renew the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program, ensure FDA regulatory flexibility, and continue to find new innovative ways to promote investment in treatments for rare disease. These policies don't just help families, they drive biotech innovation, drug development, and economic growth. Thank you very much for your time and considering how vital it is to keep these pathways open. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Farrell, and thank you so much for sharing that beautiful photo of Frankie and his progress. It's so heartening to hear. And next, I would like to invite Arya Singh to share her remarks.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you for coming. My name is Arya Singh. I am a current PhD candidate in population health at Weill Cornell Medicine. I work in public health research at NYU Langone, and I have a master's in public health and bachelor's degree from Yale. But I'm here today more because I was also born with spinal muscular atrophy, which is a rare neuromuscular disease that causes persistent and progressive muscular weakness. It is actually similar in a lot of ways to Duchenne muscular dystrophy. When I was born, there were 0 safe and effective drugs for SMA, making the disease ultimately fatal, and patients with the most severe form died before the age of 2 in their natural history. But interestingly, SMA also represented the #1 genetic killer in infants, despite it being such a rare disease, only affecting 1 in 10,000 kids. I was diagnosed at 18 months old with a moderate form of the disease 2 days before my brother was born, and literally right after 9/11, after missing milestone after milestone. When I was diagnosed, my parents were told me that if I was lucky and had supportive care, I would live to college, but said nothing ultimately could be done to stop the bleed disease prognosis and that there were certainly no treatment options. I want to share a statement that my parents actually had made to ABC News about the parental experience of diagnosis, because I think it does summarize what a lot of parents of a rare disease patient and families of a rare disease patient feel when there aren't treatment options. So my mom said that we don't go to movies anymore. Watching someone in my big fat Greek wedding while everyone else was laughing, I was crying, because it reminds you that your daughter probably won't have the luxury of, going through a stressful wedding scenario. And then my dad commented that every day, every month that goes by and she loses more that she probably won't get back is going to make that life that remains for her that much more difficult. And that's why the clock is ticking every day, because every day there's another dream that gets lost. I don't care what condition our daughter's in, we want her around. But there's just no doubt that if she can have a great active life in some way too, that would be so much better, obviously. And I just want you to hold on to that for a second. Of note, though, SMA was actually a quite lucky rare disease in the scheme of rare disease, because the mutation causing that disease, which was a mutation in the survivor motor neuron, had been discovered just a few years before I was born in 1995, giving it a very real shot at being treated from a scientific perspective. But there was just no investment from pharma, government, or investors, given the very, very small patient population and the enormous cost of research and development. My parents were not willing to accept that nothing could be done to save their daughter when the science was quite literally right in front of them. So they ultimately founded the Spinal Muscular Atrophy Foundation within months of my diagnosis, which only had one mission, which was to develop a treatment for SMA. The foundation ultimately served as a merger of pharma, academia, government, ultimately funding over $150 million to spearhead the now 3 safe and effective drugs for SMA, of which I spent 20 years of my life in clinical research for. I was the first patient in the world to receive one of the drugs that I'm still on, and the third in the world to receive the other. In my lifetime, I've watched SMA go from a fatal to a chronic disease in 25 years, which even as a young child, I knew that was quite remarkable. And so instead of not surviving past college, I've had that great active life that my parents thought I would never experience at the time of diagnosis. I graduated at the top of my class and delivered commencement at Yale a couple years ago. I got married just this year, last year. And so I got to have that luxury of a stressful wedding scenario that my mom initially sobbed at being certain I wouldn't have when she watched my big fat Greek wedding. And now I work in research and am pursuing a PhD. And so I know that I'm very, very lucky. My 20 years of clinical research experience and lived experiences more broadly have led me to advocating for timely diagnosis and access to care for rare disease patients. And, ultimately, I hope my story shows 2 things. One, that there really is real hope to give rare disease patients a chance to have a life that extends beyond illness and is filled with the same aspirations and experiences as any other American in this country. But that this hope really is only actualized when we ensure timely access to diagnosis and treatment by fostering environments that incentivize and rationalize investment from pharma, government, and investors.
Thank you very much, Arya. And finally, Ritu Baral.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Ritu Baral. I am known as I am what is known as an equity research analyst in biotech. Basically, what it means is I work for an investment bank, and my job is to advise investors, both specialist investors within biotech, but also generalist investors who invest across fields on specific biotech companies. I have focused from the very beginning of my 20-year career on rare disease companies, rare disease biotechnology companies. And as that field has progressed and the technology has progressed, it has led to sort of a deep specialization in gene therapy technologies, among others. An additional fun fact about me, I am also a rare disease patient. And it's a condition that I have passed on to my daughter. So I am a rare disease mother as well. I am fortunate that both my daughter and I have a very, very mild phenotype so far. And it is something as a family that we are keeping a very, very close eye on. So I represent the Wall Street perspective here. Why hasn't investment been coming in? Biotechnology has been in what's called a bear market over the last 3 years or so. It's been 3 or 4 years at this point. It's been one of the longest bear markets in my 20-year career. And there have been a number of fundamental, but also incidental factors. I'll focus on the fundamental factors and those things that can be helped. I want to highlight 3 things going on, 3 fundamental factors that have really choked off investment over the last 3 or 4 years and entered U.S. biotech into this sort of recessionary environment where investor capital is too expensive to move things forward. I want to focus on 3 things: predictability, clarity, and consistency. I'm going to be very blunt. I am not as eloquent as my fellow panel members because I need to get to the point, because my clients, who are investment managers, have the attention span of hamsters. So I'm going to be extremely focused here. Investors love predictability. Investors need to be able to make a plan, establish expectations, and meet them, and in a timely fashion. Look, investors raise investment funds against promised returns, and they establish a time point for those established returns, promised returns, and they need to be able to keep those promises. Otherwise, they cannot raise money to then in turn invest. And a lot of unusual things have happened over the last 5 or 6 years, starting from COVID, moving after that. And that has been incredibly disruptive to our investors keeping their own promises to those parties that they have raised money from. This includes the PRVs, which I think we'll talk about more later. But PRVs factor into the cost of capital for rare disease companies. And that is something that's just up and gone away when the investment community thought that that the U.S. government was vested enough to make it something that was long-term. Investors love flexibility, almost as much as patients with unmet needs love flexibility, but they love predictability and clear line of sight even more. And that clear line of sight is the clarity that I mentioned as my second bullet point. And in this case, it's clarity and confidence in the FDA. This spans CBER and CDER. They are the gatekeepers to revenue. That is how we look at it here on Wall Street. FDA is the gatekeeper to revenues, and revenues make the whole investment machine run. New decision makers, not just leadership, but the reviewers themselves, the rank and file, right? New decision makers, less experienced decision makers, and broken continuity is an absolute poison to investment. Add on top of that, look, communications offices have been dismantled and condensed and streamlined, but streamlined to the point where they're constrained and choked even. So if we are looking for that clarity, we are not finding it. And that is, again, something that significantly impairs the building of an investment thesis. And then finally, the consistency. Consistency with the science. So one thing I would like people to come away with is the fact that when you think about investors and you think about investors in biotech, the specialists, the ones that control the majority of money that is going into biotech companies, they are PhDs and MDs. They are specialists. They are scientists. They are trained scientists. At one point, they probably decided they liked money a bit more, and jumped over to the dark side, as a lot of us call it. But that is their training. And consistency with the science translates into consistency over time. It translates into consistency with the truth. And that is just consistency that you can rely on at the end of the day. So I would say those are the three most important things that I want people to walk away with that does need to be improved from the current landscape in order to promote additional investment.
Great. Thank you, Ritu, and to all of our panelists for sharing your opening thoughts on our topic today. And of course, that is the US's leadership in biopharmaceutical innovation. And when we talk about that leadership, what we mean is that the US invests the highest capital investment globally. About 50% of the global investment is from the United States, and the United States leads in the number of drugs and development pipelines and in FDA approvals of innovative therapies. And also that FDA is regarded as the world's gold standard regulator and often the first authority when sponsors seek approval for a new product. And many of the most innovative therapies, gene therapies, cell therapies, other rare disease treatments are first developed and launched in the United States. And many of our panelists touched on this in your opening remarks, but I open it up to any of you for which this question resonates. If you can just weigh in on what you see as the biggest risks as a country and a development ecosystem to maintaining that global leadership, and what can policymakers do in response to those risks?
Hi, Stacy. I can start off just because I think my comments really build off some of the ideas that Ritu introduced. The U.S. became the global leader in rare disease innovation because policymakers understood that incentives work. In many ways, the Orphan Drug Act of 1983 spawned the entire field of rare disease innovation by leveraging incentives. There were fewer than 40 orphan drugs before its passage, and today, thanks to the ODA and other similar incentives, there's over 600. But it takes a long time to develop a drug. And the decisions that are made today are based on the confidence in what the world will look like in 10 years. And for any incentive that's in place to have its intended effect, not like every actor in the ecosystem needs confidence that those incentives will be in place in the future. And I think we need policymakers to understand that one of the greatest risks to rare disease innovation is that, they set the tone about, the amount of confidence that the entire ecosystem can have in the stability of incentives. And there is a lack of confidence today, not only because, there was this, we're in the midst of a lapse in the PRV program, but there were earlier signals in years prior, including some of the erosion of the benefits of the Orphan Drug Act. So I think that the greatest risk is the risk of confidence linked to an uncertainty about the commitment of policymakers to rare disease innovation.
Look, the more times I have to change my Excel and the more times that investment thesis and an investment return has to change, the less I and my investment managers will want to look at something a second time over. And that's what the lapse in the PRV has been. It's changed the cost of capital negatively. That's what this lack of clarity with MFN has been. Like, if you have to change the price of a drug, it changes literally everything about an investment model. I would say those are a couple. That is one of the major things. Do not change something that was promised. If you do, it will negatively impact everything after that, every additional program, every additional investment. And the other thing, as far as what is damaging future leadership, I mean, there's a lot of people running around unplugging incubators right now. As a mom whose daughter came out straight into the NICU, I know what that sounds like, and that's exactly what I want people to feel. The incubators for the next generation of drugs are being unplugged. And there is going to be less to choose from. We are already seeing that. Look, we're already seeing many of my companies that I follow, they are bringing the next generation of drugs over from China, which has been a huge separate issue of ceding leadership specifically to China and the overlapping national security concerns there. But this will only continue the longer the incubators in the US are left unplugged.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of you for sharing. And, it's clear from some of the opening remarks that we have really strong science in the US that supports our global leadership. And specifically for you, Ritu and Deanna, if you can talk about instances where programs are discontinued or incubators unplugged, not due to the science, but due to regulatory or policy barriers. And what are some of the challenges that cause, Deanna, from the company perspective and Ritu from the investor perspective, to walk away from these programs altogether?
Deanna, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator, has a unique point of view on this subject because we really focus on the abandoned programs. We focus on programs where it's been established that the asset's struggling to raise funds, and there's a wide web of causal factors there. Policy and regulatory factors, uncertainty can certainly kill programs. Even in a clinical stage program is going to require tens of millions or potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to reach that point of filing that final approval with FDA. And when we think about the fact that in addition to having uncertainty on the reward side, right, about what will be there with regards to revenue, or whether we're talking about payer coverage or PRV, there's also uncertainty in the route of actual, drug development. So 95% of rare diseases do not have an approved treatment. That means that there is, while there's regulatory uncertainty affects all therapeutic development, for those 95% of rare diseases that have never had an FDA approved treatment, there's already an additional layer of regulatory uncertainty about where that goalpost is. So, I'll say that, it is certainly helpful to have, it's encouraging to see some of the recent program announcements from FDA, including the rare disease evidence principles that would help provide that individual clarity on the disease level as to where the goalpost is. But I think due to Ritu actually mentioned in her opening remarks that there's fundamental issues, and then there's sort of these incidental issues, and there's been a number of cases where when we look at maybe the Barth syndrome community, or we look at the Sanfilippo syndrome community, where there's this concern that even when you're getting information from FDA on the disease specific level about where those goalposts are, that it's not clear that that's really where they're going to be. So, I have to note that that entire constellation of uncertainty, from our perspective, of course we get a a diligence packet. We see that initial really promising, exciting clinical data, and we have to pitch to our partners, to potential funders, what that path to getting to revenue will look like. And when from A to Z, it's littered with uncertainty about what it's going to take to get there, and if even the information that we have from FDA is really going to represent where those goalposts are, and if the incentives that policymakers establish, whether those will actually be there when we need them. It is just it's extraordinarily difficult for us to bring all the stakeholders that need to believe what that path forward looks like, when there is right now tremendous uncertainty baked in to almost every step between us and providing sustainable access to patients.
Stacy, I think, and I've seen so many examples of gene therapies for monogenic diseases. We're talking MPSs, we're talking Fabry, a lot of lysosomal storage diseases, et cetera, just shelved. I was just going over a piece a few days ago about a Fabry gene therapy that was just shelved because the company is running on fumes. The cost of capital is just too high. This is independent of a PRV. It's just the funding environment we're in, which is related to interest rates, as it turns out. Biotech is certainly a maturing field, and I don't think anybody knew how leveraged to interest rates this sector is until it actually happened. The field is so new. This is the first time we're actually living through a pro-inflationary time, but it has meant that those incentives, like the PRV, are that much more important. Anything you can do to bring down that cost of capital will result in companies being able to spend more money to get things further and hopefully get things over that sort of hill of an investment and line of sight to approval. And like I said, approval is the gate to revenues. It used to be that investment in rare diseases didn't make sense below 10,000 patients overall. With the cost of capital now, it doesn't make sense if it's under 5,000. And now with MFN and the lack of clarity around MFN, that's not 5,000 worldwide, which it used to be. It's 5,000 in the US alone, because we don't know how to value Europe at this point. We don't know where the prices are going to end up. We can count on the US population and the US healthcare system, which, again, most of these investors are US focused. This is what we know. This is what is reliable. It's gotten less reliable, but we have to remove entire geographies from our value model. And you can imagine what that's done to valuations. The other thing, the other point around MFN is that it makes partnership that much more unpredictable for other geographies. It used to be, if you were a small biotech.
Ritu, could I interrupt for a moment? Could you explain to the group who may not know what you mean by MFN?
So most favored nation, this is a drug pricing issue, right? Where the administration has basically said the US is going to get the best price no matter in the world. And I think there have been allowances for GDP normalization. Obviously, if you have a country with a very, very low GDP, per capita income, you can't expect the same price. But basically, if you are going to normalize prices across the world, you're going to be changing those revenue prices in my Excel, and you're going to be changing a lot of them. And I think I already talked about what happens when you make me change my Excel models. And that's literally what's happening now. So we don't know what those prices are going to be. And those are the drivers of my valuation models. So we talked about PRV. The other thing I want to mention is as companies expand, oftentimes these small companies, they're not the ones selling it in Europe. They can't afford it. European sales reps are really expensive. They will license it. They will set a partnership up for Europe, for Japan, for Australia. And that usually was an easy, $50 million, $100 million check that company could generate by selling geographic rights. Well, now those geographic rights have implications on the price. You can't just sell it to anybody. You can't just sell it to whoever's the highest bidder for those geographic rights. You have to get their buy-in for pricing, which these companies never had to do. So that is another source of income that MFN has taken off the table for now.
Yeah, thank you. And Ryan, I see your hand up as well, if you'd like to weigh in.
I just wanted to speak a little bit to beyond what has already been said, just sort of the logistics. I think when we talk about conditions like SMA and we talk about conditions like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, hemophilia, these are all conditions that are classified as rare diseases. They are also the slightly more common of the rare diseases. And these are easier diseases to recruit, for things like clinical trials. But for our much more rare conditions, it becomes problematic sometimes when the FDA is expecting or requiring a true placebo-controlled gold standard trial that logistically sometimes is just not feasible. And this is going to be a call to action in just a moment. When you're talking about so few patients, there really isn't a reasonable way to placebo control those patients and compare them to each other. And it requires ultimately the use of historical controlled data, which I think is really important in that, one, it can potentially reduce the costs of running a clinical trial. But secondly, I think, in terms of ways that we can enact this, it's really important that we have reasonable historical controlled data to begin with. And the use of things like registries and having an organization that can be supported at a national level so that there is the appropriate comparison data will actually allow for these ultra rare conditions to have something to compare to historically to show the potential improvement when a new therapy is being studied. And I think that in turn, results ultimately in reduction in cost. It also reduces time because we don't have to wait for that second year comparison, between the experimental group and the control group. So I just wanted to point out just how important the use of historical control data can be for particularly ultra rare conditions.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. And it's very illuminating for you to review the various tools that Congress has empowered FDA to use to bring the availability of new treatments in these diseases that are challenging to study. And in rare diseases, there are many challenges, and our panelists have reviewed them: the heterogeneity, small patient populations, and features of the interventions we're studying. Arya, I would be curious from your perspective. We've heard from other panelists these themes of the importance of clarity around regulatory decision making, and you also shared really powerful insights from your parents as they were presented with this diagnosis. And I would love to hear from you when you think about some of Ryan's themes about regulatory flexibility or advancements in regulatory science. When we have a lack of clarity about the approach to rare disease from a regulatory perspective, how do you make sense of that as a patient with rare disease? And any thoughts you have on how it impacts the outlook on the possibility of new treatments?
Yeah, thank you. while I do believe and hope that SMA is a case study for hope in the rare disease space, I think when regulatory decisions are delayed or seem unpredictable, it very directly translates to a reduced quality of life and even survival for rare disease patients and their families. And so with SMA, like my parents literally said, it was a race against the clock. And even as SMA drugs were underway, moving very quickly in the steam of the regulatory timeline, it was uncertain how quickly that would be approved and when it would get to patients. And so in that time, my parents watched me get weaker literally every day. By the time the first drug was developed, I had lost the ability to walk. By the time the second drug was developed, I had lost the ability to cough independently and therefore had developed pneumonia countless number of times just from the simple cold. Respiratory failure is the #1 cause of death for someone with SMA. And by the time the third drug was developed, I had over 20 trips to the operating room under my belt. I was consistently missing a third of the school year to be in the hospital, and I had simply just progressed too far in the disease to be eligible for treatment. And I think the astonishing thing is that this was all true despite SMA receiving, at the time, the fastest FDA approval in drug history, showing how severe any treatment delays can be, even if it seems like it's moving at lightning speed. And so I think rare disease patients' lives are already filled with uncertainty, as I think all the panelists here have shared today. And so the uncertainty of regulatory decisions really should not be an added source of disadvantage for patients to have the highest quality of life that they can have. And so I think when there is uncertainty in the regulatory landscape, it very directly negatively affects patients' quality of life and creates mistrust and uncertainty in the ecosystem that they're in. And so I think when patients are lucky enough to have treatments available to them, of which only 5% of rare disease patients are, we need to be certain that they can actually access those treatments.
That's a great point, Arya. And I'd like to pivot now back to the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program. And we received a question in the chat about the future of the PRV program in the US. And to be very clear, the program began to expire in December of 2024, and our panelists have shared the implications of that and why it is so urgent and important to reauthorize the program as soon as possible. And the bill to reauthorize the PRV program, the Give Kids a Chance Act, is currently, as we speak, being considered by the Energy and Commerce Committee. And so we're really hopeful for that progress. But on that topic, Ritu, you talked about how the PRV program plays a huge role in how you think about decisions in your work. Do you see fewer dollars flowing into some of these more challenging pediatric indications following the expiration of the PRV program in December?
Yeah, I mean, especially for smaller companies that where this may be their lead indication, right? This is their path to revenues. These PRVs, as Deanna mentioned, right, they're sold on a market. They're free market value that comes out of almost always big pharma. And they sell usually for around $150 million. That's 1 or 2 rounds and an entire rounds of funding for micro caps, for SMID caps. That's an additional 2 times that the companies don't have to go back to investors. And it's especially important for funding the next program. So these companies will slog it out, get to approval for their first program. But then the next gen or the next indication, the next group of rare disease patients are going to have to wait until they can deliver and generate revenues to that $150 million mark that they would have otherwise gotten from big pharma, not at the cost of the taxpayer. In fact, Deanna told me, I didn't even realize this, that the cost of the personnel related expense to the taxpayer for the PRVs is actually paid as well by whoever exercises the PRV. So, think of it as like an administrative premium on top of what Big Pharma has to pay. It's a program at no cost to the taxpayer. In fact, it funnels some administrative fees back to the government. And it comes out of the free market. It comes out of the pocket of those groups that, may not have necessarily are not the ones we're talking about. They're not the ones we're trying to help. They're fine. Big Pharma's fine. Somebody's going to give me a hard time for saying that, but that is where the money's coming from.
And Stacey, if I could just add a couple of anecdotes from our experience in this space. We were here when it was in place, and we are here now after, and it's night and day. So we don't have shareholders, and we don't need to justify whether a program is profitable enough to move forward, but we still need programs to be economically viable. We need there to be enough rewards for funders of different stripes and different partners to come to the table. And there are simply many, frankly, thousands of diseases where there are not enough rewards to provide those incentives without the PRV. And just this month, we closed a review of an asset with clinical data that appears life-saving. That is just simply impossible to move forward without the PRV. And we're not alone in that. The programs we review really are the tip of the iceberg. Just last week, I had a conversation with a patient leader from the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy 2I R9 community. And there's a biotech called Datamio Therapeutics that announced this April their initial clinical readout for this disease that has no therapies, and there's functional improvement for these patients. Not just slowing down disease, functional improvement for these patients. But that program has been paused explicitly because of the non-extension of PRV. So I don't think that the biotech community can be clearer that this changes the math in a truly consequential way for programs that are life-changing, life-saving, right? As Rita described, it's an exquisite piece of policy, right? It operates at no cost to the taxpayer. And we have large pharma subsidizing innovation for urgent unmet need for rare diseases. And it's breathtaking. It's breathtakingly upsetting that it was allowed to lapse. And I think that the reality is that we don't only need urgent reauthorization. We need, we do need that. We do need urgent reauthorization, but it has to go further after that. I really believe that, this mistake to allow this program to lapse, for this incentive to continue playing the extraordinary role it has in anchoring business models to serve the diseases where there's this great unmet need. We need, at minimum longer than 5 years, but ideally, a permanent authorization of this program.
Thank you, Deanna. And I think that's an excellent idea and point to end on. I will invite that if there are any remaining questions in the chat, please feel free for our audience to write your questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to address them in our remaining time. But Deanna brought up an excellent point. I think that I'd love for us to close and hear from our panel that if we imagine a world where we have a long-term reauthorization or permanent reauthorization of the PRV program, what would that mean, Ritu, from your perspective as someone who makes investment decisions? And Arya and Ryan would love to hear, I'll start with you, Ritu, but Arya and Ryan would love to hear also from your perspective, if we're imagining a world where we have a permanent incentive, powerful incentive like PRV, what that permanence would mean to hope for patients. But Ritu, I'll turn it to you to start.
Yeah, I at the end of the day, if you can prove to investors, and by letting it lapse, by the way, proving that that bar just got higher. If you can prove to investors that it is not going away again, then what you have permanently done is promised upon success, and this is another beauty of the PRV program, right? You don't get it for doing terrible programs. You don't get the reward if your science is weak, if your data is weak, if it doesn't cross the hurdle of making a difference and getting FDA approval, right? You don't get rewarded. You only get this if you've got a worthy program. You get a worthy program, your cost of capital, sort of retrospectively, the return on an investor, as well as your ability to achieve the next milestone, is permanently reduced. That cost of achieving that is permanently better for a really meaningful amount of time.
Thank you. And Arya or Ryan, if you'd like to weigh in with your thoughts.
I think beyond what's already been said, on the at the receiver level, as a parent, when you get a sense that there is expediency in review and expediency in development and ultimate approval, you have a sense that there's somebody out there that is moving the needle for you, that they're pushing things forward as best they can. When you don't feel that, there's an immediate sense of desperation, of drowning, and you start chasing things that are actually not even really meaningful, helpful treatments. You start looking for non-evidence-based treatments. You hear stories about people going out of the country seeking non-approved treatments that are not helping their children, or in fact are actually causing harm to them. This actually has direct consequences, not just economically, but also on people. People will go and seek care, will seek any answer for a desperate condition that is fatal and progressive. And we have to help alleviate that by moving into some level of expediency through things like the PRV, to give them that sense that people are moving quickly to address their unmet needs.
Thank you, Ryan. If there are any final closing thoughts that our panel would like to share, I welcome you to do so. And I'm just so grateful to each of our panelists for sharing all of their perspectives. And I think we have learned a lot today about the importance of the PRV program and how it shapes decisions from a variety of perspectives, and also the role of FDA's approach to rare disease and the critical role that it plays in hope for patients, and our ability as sponsors to move forward on behalf of our patients, and also did some thinking around the role of policies like most favored nation, reference pricing, and things that we should consider in the context of rare diseases with very high unmet need. And so I'm grateful to our panel and for our audience today, and thank you very much for your engagement and participation.